Hey, what's up, guys? So back here for another little segment. I hope you guys enjoyed the first one, talking about undulating periodization and the alternation between accumulation and intensification. So as I mentioned in the last presentation, I would provide a sample of a 12-week periodization progression, kind of not necessarily the complete program, but kind of how I would plan out the 12 weeks for one of my athletes. So let's see here. So just if you didn't see the previous video, here's just a little summary of undulating periodization, or alternating between accumulation and intensification phases. So essentially, accumulation is a higher volume, lower intensity phase, where intensification is the reverse. It's a lower volume, but a higher intensity. And essentially, you alternate between these phases. So the first phase of the summer, or the 12 weeks, might be an accumulation. Then the second phase would be intensification, and then you alternate and go back to accumulation and finish with intensification. And the reason why we do this is because you're able to essentially improve two traits or multiple traits at the same time. So accumulation might focus more on muscle hypertrophy, where intensification is more on strength or speed. And because of the residual effects of training, strength is not, you don't lose your strength after it takes about 25 to 30 days to lose your strength. So essentially, switching every 3 weeks, you're able to maintain strength levels when you're focused more on hypertrophy, and vice versa. So in the end, at the end of the 12 weeks, you're able to have more muscle mass and be stronger and faster. So to give you guys a little overview of a very basic general 12 weeks that I would give to one of my athletes. I want to preface this by saying this, normally when I start with an athlete, or at the beginning of a 12 weeks, I come up with a 12-week plan. But I would say 90% of the time, there are changes made to the plan. It's basically what I do is I figure out, okay, what I know, from what I know about the athlete, where do I need to get him to be at certain periods of time before the season. So I lay out a general idea of what I'm going to do, but most of the time it ends up switching. So what I give to you guys today, I might come up with this before the 12 weeks, but during that 12 week, it might change. For the sake of this, let's pretend that this athlete, this is what we did for 12 weeks. Okay. So you guys could look over the reps and intensities, but I'll explain that throughout the presentation. So the first phase, accumulation 1, for 100% of our athletes, is a structural balance phase. It might not necessarily be a hypertrophy phase, but most of the time our athletes come to us out of shape and with minor, let's say, injuries or mobility issues. So what we focus on are a lot of unilateral exercises to address imbalances between left and right, front and back. And we also include a lot of higher metabolic, higher time under tension exercises to build tissue resilience, as well as add some tissue that they might have lost during the season. So how we do that, normally we include slower tempos, so slow eccentrics, maybe some isometrics. One of the things I like to include in this phase are pauses in the stretch position. So for example, in a split squat, normally our athletes come to us with tight hip flexors, tight ankles. So the split squat, as you see in the top left, is one of the best exercises. And what I like to do is kind of add a little pause in the bottom, just to add more of a stretch to the ankle and the hip flexor. Also, this phase, normally there are shorter rest periods, just because we're trying to get back into shape, so we're trying to improve our fitness, and have it mainly be metabolic work. So if you kind of look at the program, it's almost like there's no main lift. It's just accessory exercises. There might be 1 or 2 main lifts in the program, but 90% of the program is accessory work. So small movements, higher amount of reps, lower intensity. So here would be a sample leg training session. So as I mentioned, the polyquid split squat is a go-to of mine. And as you can see in the tempo, I added a 3-second stretch in the bottom. Again, as I mentioned, to increase the ankle dorsiflexion and hip extension. Then with that, there's some unilateral work with the leg curl, the polyquid step up. If you don't know what that is, it's a single leg cyclist. Is a very high elevated heel. I added a slow eccentric to kind of target the VMO a little bit more, and then finish with groin and abs. So as you can see, it's a lot of little exercises, but it's a lot of exercises that we need to use to correct imbalances when we get our athletes. So now the intensification phase. Normally this is a strength phase, but this very much depends on what the athlete needs. So a lot of our younger athletes, we kind of stick to more of a functional hypertrophy. So yes, it is like a higher intensity, so less reps than the first phase, but it wouldn't necessarily be considered in the strength rep range. But for the sake of this example, it is. So this is when we start to include more complex exercises such as squats, barbell bench pressing, and maybe some deadlifts. So we do still maintain some unilateral work in this phase just because it's too far away from the season to exclude them. Not to mention they're not skating as much, so being able to do more unilateral work won't dive into the recovery as much. Due to the fact that they're more complex exercises and the intensity is increased, this training is a little bit more neural based. So we require longer rest periods in between sets, primarily for the main exercises. And then, as I mentioned, the unilateral work kind of goes hand in hand with the hypertrophy work. I'm a big believer in maintaining hypertrophy work for at least the first three phases, because a lot of our athletes lost a lot of muscle mass and could use the extra volume from assistance work. So a sample training session here, as you can see, we go to a barbell front squat. So it's a more complex exercise. We use the heels elevated to get a little bit more quad, and there's still the slow tempos. But as you can see, there's a 3 minutes rest as opposed to the 90 seconds rest in the first phase. Then we follow that up with some more unilateral work, such as the Bulgarian split squats and an eccentric overload of single leg curl. And then I still like to maintain some remedial exercises such as adductors, abs, maybe some lower back, just because they still haven't, there's still imbalances needed to be worked on. Now, we go back to an accumulation phase, but it's not exactly the same as the first one because we're getting closer to the season, so strength is starting to become more of a focus. So this is more so where we add the functional hypertrophy and then a higher rep strength phase. So it is a decrease in intensity from phase 2, but it still does include some strength or neurological work. But the big thing about this phase is that it's the highest total volume in the 12-week progression. So it was funny because I was reading some of Verkhoshansky's old articles, and one thing that I noticed was a lot of the athletes, it was about a month or two that they had the heaviest workload before competing, and this fits in perfectly with this, as we're about let's say about 6, 7 weeks away from the season, and this is when the guys are training more. So they're doing 4 strength training sessions, they have 2 cardio sessions, and they're on the ice a lot more. So in terms of recovery, this is going to be a very challenging phase. So an example of a training session here, we got we maintain the neurological work. So as you can see, yes, we're in the 6 to 8 reps, but we do include a set of 4 reps. just to get some more strength and increase the intensity, but compared to phase the accumulation one. But then what you could see is that the A series is a higher amount of volume compared to intensification one, and the B series we're at 4 sets. So if you look at the total amount of work done in one single session, it is the highest amount of volume. So the athletes need to understand that yes, the 3 weeks is going to be very difficult, but it's needed and is going to be preceded by a lower volume kind of super compensation phase, I guess you could call it. So now the final phase, this is the peaking or the realization phase. It's technically an intensification 2 phase, but I kind of look at it as more as a, we're trying to get the guys to recover faster, get them ready for the seasons. They're skating a lot more, so that should be the emphasis. So then in the gym, we're essentially just trying to transfer their gains in strength for the previous 9 weeks and to transfer that into speed and power on the ice or the field or whatever their sport is. So this phase is the lowest volume phase of the 12-week progression, just because we're 3 weeks away from the season. They had just gone through 3 weeks of a very high volume phase. So now we need to begin the taper or the recovery heading into the season. Now, even though it might sound like it's we're thinking about recovery, it doesn't mean that we slack off the training. This training is a little bit more focused on speed. So there is still a high intensity. It is still neurologically demanding, but it's not as muscularly taxing, and you're able to kind of manipulate the trainings a little bit to increase the recovery. So one of the ways I like to do it is to include 3 sessions and then 1 kind of remedial day. So instead of having 4 very hard sessions, they're only having 3. Now this phase is also kind of the one that I characterize as being the most flexible. So if you have a young athlete, you don't need to go into complex training. I still believe that you should focus on strength, but you can include some plyometrics if you want. But let's say for more advanced athletes, this is the most fun part of the summer, because you're able to do more speed work. You're able to do complex training, and it's a little bit more fun than counting tempos and reps. So an example of a session is a very, very typical session. I use the heavy light method. So we do a heavy trap bar deadlift. Essentially, there's no tempo. The only thing that I ask is that a 2-second dead stop. So working on that starting strength. And then 15 seconds later, after you catch your breath, perform 3 explosive hurdle jumps. And then after that, you have a 3 to 4 minute rest. Now, this doesn't work either strength or speed, but the emphasis of this is to transfer and to teach the athlete to use the gains in strength and transfer it to power. And this was something that I only recently began to understand. I always considered this to be just an explosive phase, but I didn't think of it as being you're teaching the athlete's nervous system to produce a high amount of force at a faster rate. So that's essentially the emphasis of this phase. And then, as always, I like to always include some assistance work, but it's more complex and a little bit more explosive work. So glute ham raises are more complex than leg curls, because it's using both the posterior chain as a knee flexor and hip extensor, and then a barbell reverse drop lunge, which is a pretty, it's almost like a plyometric. It's supposed to be very explosive, and there's a fast eccentric because you're dropping from a 3-inch box. So just to kind of, if you looked over the whole 12 weeks, as you can see, there's a little bit of an undulation going on. So in the red, you can see is the intensity, and it goes up, and it goes up, and then it comes down for a little bit, and that would be the accumulation 2 phase, and then it goes back up gradually. Whereas the volume starts high, comes down a little bit, goes back up for, again, the accumulation 2 phase, and then drops down to its lowest. Now, I don't necessarily like to use or characterize certain percents for these phases, just because if you got an athlete at the beginning of the summer, and okay, let's say you do 4 sets of 10, well, 10% might be 65% of his 1 rep max. Well, he's detrained, so the weight he might use might be 50%. All right. And then the next week he makes a 20-pound jump on his lift. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's 20 pounds stronger. All right. So I just kind of use these as a guideline to kind of how I would program the rep schemes and throughout the full 12-week progression. So here's a little overview of the 12 weeks. We start off in accumulation 1 with 4 sets of 10 for a total volume of 40 reps with an intensity approximately 75. Intensification 1, drop down to 5 sets of 5 for a total volume of 25 reps and at around an 86% intensity. For accumulation 2, we bump the volume up to 32 compared to intensification 1, but we're using a higher intensity rep scheme using 8-8-6-6-4. And then for the final phase, intensification 2, we drop down to 6 sets of 3 reps at around roughly 92%. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. As always, if you have any questions, my email is there, my Instagram is there. Please don't hesitate to send me an email. And I look forward to hearing back some feedback. So we'll see you next time, guys.